Assalamu alaikum students. This is Ms. Shumaila Hussain, and today I will be telling you rules for debit and credit in accounting. So this is just a simple thing that everybody needs to remember, because if you don't remember the accounting rules, then you will have problems understanding how to put those transactions into the right place. So let's get started with the rules for debit and credit in accounting. Now, the first slide which I'm sharing now is showing us an increase in an asset. It goes on the debit side, and increase in the expense goes on the debit side. Liability increases, it goes on the credit side. Revenue increases, it goes on the credit side. Capital increases, goes on the credit side. Moving on to the rules again, when it decreases, when the asset decreases, it goes on the credit side. When the expense decreases, it goes on the credit side. When the liability decreases, it goes on the debit side. When revenue decreases, it goes on the debit side. And if capital decreases, goes on the debit side. Now this is just a simple thing which every one of us need to remember. Moving on to the assets, the types of assets. Actually, assets are what? Assets are of two types, okay? And we have the current assets and the fixed assets. Now, we should be having an idea what assets are. Assets basically are two types, okay? And when you talk about the current assets, it's just it's used in the day-to-day operations of a business, all right? So that the business is in a when the business is in a running position, it keeps using those current assets. And when you talk about the fixed assets, it's just those simple physical assets such as the property and the plant and the machinery which is used in the business. And fixed assets have a useful life of more than 1 year. Current assets include cash. It's just a simple example which I'm sharing here. Current assets can be your cash, your bank, your trade receivables, your prepayments, and your stock. Let's talk about what trade receivables are. Trade receivables, you may also call it accounts receivable. They are actually the goods that you sell to your customer on credit basis. When you are not receiving the money when you're selling your goods, and then you don't get the money on that time when you're selling, and you're just selling it for credit, and then you will not be receiving, you will receive the money, but in the near future. So this is also an asset, because you will of course be receiving the money maybe in a year, maybe in 6 months, maybe 3 years. So this is your trade receivables. Prepayments are the money is the amount that is paid to you in advance. This can also be your asset, because the money that you are getting from your customers in advance can be used, okay, for your business. And the stock that you have, stock can be the goods that you are selling in your business. So this stock can be a source of goods which is sold in the business. Now let's move on to non-current assets. I may just give you a little definition about what non-current assets are. Non-current assets are a company's long-term investments that are not easily converted to cash or are not expected to become cash within an accounting year. Now, let me give you a few examples. Building is your non-current asset, machinery, van, motor vehicle. These are all your non-current assets. All right, now let's move on to expenses. Now, expenses, what are expenses? An expense is the cost of operations that a company incurs to generate revenue. Now, a businessman or a businesswoman runs a business in order to generate revenue. Now, to generate revenue, he will have to go through expenses. All right. Now, there are two main categories of business expenses in accounting: operating expenses and non-operating expenses. That we'll be discussing it later. And what type of expenses are there? Let's discuss. When we have those expenses in business, we have the rent, we have salaries to be given to the employees, we have the wages and the advertisement that is needed to be done to run a business. Then the insurance, there are many of them. I'm just discussing a few with you, and I guess I have just mentioned 5 expenses here. So there are many. When you will just go in a detailed form, then you will be learning your expenses as well. Moving on to your revenue. What is revenue? Revenue is the total amount of income which is generated by the sale of goods or services. So there are just 2 revenues I've mentioned here: sales or rent revenue, or you may also call it rent received. What is capital? Capital is the asset that you bring into the business. It can be your current and your fixed assets together. The money that you put into the business, the money that you are investing in the business is your capital. Okay, and capital, as I explained you just now, that it can be your current or your non-current asset. All right, moving on to the liability section. When there are 2 types of liabilities in the business: the current liabilities and the long-term liabilities. Now, what are current liabilities? Current liabilities, they need to be paid within a year's time. And how does it arise? It arises from the routine of operations done in the business. And we have those the liabilities. For example, if we buy goods from our suppliers and we don't pay for the goods, then we need to pay the liability within a year's time. So such a liability is known as trade payable or accounts payable. And there is another liability that we have. We make I'm just moving on to the next part. Okay, so I just told you trade payables. And trade payables, just now I told you that trade payables are something that we buy from the suppliers and we don't pay them on time, and they need to be paid within a year's time. And we have also accruals and owings. What does accrual mean? Accrual means that something which is not paid, it's an outstanding amount which needs to be paid. For example, if you are paying for the electricity, or if you are paying for the salaries, when a business pays the salaries or the wages or the bills, the insurance, anything which needs to be paid and it's not paid or it's partly paid, those are your accruals, those are your owings. So they will be paid in the near future. All right, so this is also a liability for the business because it needs to be paid. Then we come to the last part, and we have this bank overdraft. Everybody knows about the bank account. Whatever we put into the bank is your asset. But when the business does not have anything remaining in the bank account, when the bank account is totally zero, then the business asks the bank authority to pay them a little figure, a small figure, which is a type of a loan given to the businessman by the bank. So this is also a liability to the business. Why? Because this bank overdraft, it needs to be paid to the business, to the bank. Okay, so coming on to the long term loan or the long term liability. In the long term loan, or you may call it the long term liability, it's a non current asset and which has to be paid. We are given a time frame. It can be paid after a year. It can be more than 2 years. It can be more than 3 years. It can be 10 years as well. So these are called long-term loan, and they arise from long-term funding. Long-term loans or debentures, etc., are the examples of your non-current liabilities. Alright, students, now I'm about to end my lecture, and this is actually we did the rules for debit and credit in accounting. We also learned something about assets, the types of assets, and then we also did the expenses. What sort of expenses are there in the beginning of your accounting practice? Okay, because as you are very new to the chapter, so I am not going very much into detail. I'm just giving you a fair idea of how expenses look like. Okay, and then revenue is the main part. So if you're running a business, of course you will be focusing on revenues as well. So controlling the expenses and then generating your revenue out of your sales, out of your services. And then we also learned about the capital that is brought into the business. And then we also learned about the types of liabilities which takes place in the business. And you also must have got an idea of what liabilities are. So see you soon, inshallah ta'ala, and I will be preparing another lecture for you soon. And if you have any queries, if you have any questions, you can put into the comment box, and you can subscribe the channel for more lessons. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.